So let us begin. For those of you, I'm June Murray. I am the director of the U.S. Foreign Policy Program. And it is my delight to introduce my colleague and friend, Sharon Weiner, who will be talking about her new book, Our Own Worst Enemy. For those of you who don't know Sharon, and I suspect there might be a few of you in here, she's a professor in the U.S. Foreign Policy Program at SIS. She's on sabbatical this year, which is why you haven't seen her around. She is an expert in proliferation issues. She's also an expert in how organizational interests can manifest themselves in ways that lead to less than rational outcomes, as you will be hearing today.
You don't get that part, do you?
Her career, she's done such interesting things as worked for the House Armed Services Committee. She's been a research assistant at Los Alamos National Laboratory. She's had a long time association with Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. And she is the recipient of the Carnegie Scholar with Vision Award.
Scholar of Vision.
Scholar of Vision Award.
That's interesting.
That's all the official stuff. For those of you who do know her, maybe I'll say a few things other than that. That's off of her resume. Sharon's a Renaissance woman. She's interesting in other ways besides her career. She's one of the few people I know that does her own drywall. She grows enough squash to take to market. She refurbishes antique furniture. She's a world traveler, a Renaissance woman, an interesting person. And we also have George Berkovitz. This will be the first time I've met him, so I won't tell you about his hobbies.
Not as interesting.
I'm sure they are equally interesting.
I'm sure you can do drywall too.
I'm sure they are equally interesting, but I will stick to the official resume. Who's Vice President of Studies and also the Director of the Nuclear Policy Program at Carnegie. He's written an award-winning book, India's Nuclear Bomb. He also wrote the Adelphi paper, Abolishing Nuclear Weapons, which became the basis for a book. He is an advisor to the International Commission on Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on U.S. nuclear policy. And we are delighted that you are here. Sharon will speak on her book for 15 minutes. George will discuss her book then for 15 minutes, and we'll open it up to the audience. Can you help me give a warm welcome?
Thank you, Shun, for most of the introduction. Thank you all for coming. I'm on sabbatical, so for me, this semester means nothing. For you, I know this is close. Yes, hissing is appropriate. For you, I know this is close to the week of maximum panic and work, so I appreciate you all coming. Thank you very much. I also want to take just an opportunity to thank students and colleagues for all the times people ask me, how is the book going? You finished with the book yet? How is it going? How's that? And who really expressed an interest in that, and who did things for me so that I didn't have to do them so I could work on the book. I appreciate all of the questions, all the times you asked, and all the things you did, so thank you. But let me tell you a little bit about the book for those of you who haven't yet seen the movie. So the book is prompted by an issue about the fate of the Soviet nuclear weapons complex. The Soviet nuclear, I should also say biological and chemical weapons complexes, but most of what I write about is the fate of the Soviet nuclear weapons complex. Okay? Some of you will remember this place called the Soviet Union. Many of you have no formative memory of it. There used to be this place that existed. It had a massive nuclear arsenal. They had multiple redundant facilities, and suddenly in 1990, the Soviet Union disappeared, 1990-91. And the question was, what becomes of people who make nuclear weapons for a country which no longer exists, and who are suddenly finding themselves living in a position where their standard of living is significantly reduced, and their salary is significantly reduced. In other words, what happens to a poor nuclear weapons scientist? And in particular, to try and make money or to keep their kids out of poverty, will they sell their skills for money to a country like Iran or North Korea or a group like Al-Qaeda? Okay. So the book starts off with this problem. How do you ensure that this problem isn't realized? For those of you who have been reading the papers recently, you know that the International Atomic Energy Agency released a report suggesting that a former Soviet nuclear weapons expert helped Iran with significant nuclear weapons-related skills. Okay. So far, this is really the only individual that has been pinpointed, and there's still some questions about whether or not he had weapons-relevant skills or exactly what he contributed. But in 1990, the fear was that this might happen a lot. Okay. And so the book looks at, well, what did we do to try and solve this problem? And the answer is we did a lot. The US government established a variety of different programs, and I'm not going to call them by name because they all have acronyms. Some of the acronyms are the same for different programs. The acronyms change over time. Try writing a book based only in acronyms. It drives editors crazy. Okay? But the US funded programs that were administered by the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and the Department of Energy. So I'll talk about the parent agencies, Defense, State, and Energy. Okay? They said, go create civilian jobs for people with nuclear weapons skills. So you will convert them, take them out of the defense complex, and give them something new, some commercial employment to do, so they'll have money, they won't sell their skills for knowledge, and lo and behold, the Russian nuclear weapons complex will be smaller. So it'll be good for us. So my book is about how well did we do in that agenda. All right? And the good news is the people who were committed to this agenda were smart. They tried hard. They worked long hours. There was a commitment among people in all of these agencies and overall in the US government that was personal. I know people at some facilities, a scientist at one of the US nuclear weapons labs in particular, who mortgaged his house when the funding ran out for his cooperative project with his colleagues in Russia. It was that important to him to continue doing this. Okay? So it isn't that people didn't care or that people weren't committed. They were. How many jobs did we create for all these nuclear weapons scientists over now almost 20 years? Maybe a couple thousand. The more disturbing answer is we don't know because nobody really counted. Okay. Estimates were there were 60,000 weapons of mass destruction experts who had some skill that might be useful for a state that wanted to make nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. Okay? We created at most 2,000 or 3,000 jobs. Like I said, we don't know because people didn't count. And so the question is why? Why didn't we do better? And so the book tries to explain this, and it looks at 3 different explanations. One explanation is those pesky Russians, they were hard to work with. Russia inherited the bulk of the Soviet nuclear weapons complex, and of the states that came from the former Soviet Union, Russia was the only one that had a nuclear weapons program. Everybody else gave up their nuclear weapons. So really the book becomes very quickly about Russia and converting Russian nuclear weapons experts to civilian jobs. Okay? So one argument is the Russians are hard to work with. This was about national security, so they don't freely talk about nuclear weapons experts. And they were a little skeptical about US and US motives and intentions after the collapse of the Cold War. Okay. That did create problems. They weren't the most significant problems. Second explanation is Congress. Okay. Congress was composed of a group of Republicans who thought this agenda with Russia, which was part of a larger group of projects called cooperative threat reduction. There was an argument that there was a group of Republicans in Congress that thought cooperative threat reduction was really charity and social work in Russia, and that we shouldn't do it because they were our enemy. Okay? So I look at that explanation. There are some problems, some things that Congress caused, but that's not the most significant issue. The most significant issue, and I talk about this probably in more detail than almost anybody will care about except for me in the book, is that the Departments of Defense, State, and Energy are very large bureaucracies. Okay? Bureaucracy is a fact of life in government, right? So what I do is look at these 3 agencies as bureaucracies and see how they implemented the programs they were given. They're all given the same task. Go create civilian jobs for former Soviet nuclear weapons scientists. Okay? And what I discover is they engaged in several typical bureaucratic outcomes, bureaucratic activities. Okay, and I'm just going to talk about 3 of them today. One is what's called goal displacement. You can give an agency a goal, but it doesn't mean that's the goal they'll pursue. Right? So these agencies were told, defense, state, and energy, go create jobs for former nuclear weapons scientists. So energy and state, those departments came not to create jobs for weapons scientists, but their goal was, how many weapons scientists can you meet on a given day? Okay, that's a little shorthand, a little flip, but they measured not jobs created, but the number of scientists they talked to and they worked with. Didn't matter if that work led to a job. It didn't actually really matter if the person they talked to had critical nuclear weapons skills or, in fact, any nuclear weapons skills. Okay? They counted towards the goal because the goal became for them not to create jobs, but to engage people in the nuclear weapons complex. And that's a very different goal. Okay? For the Defense Department, they were told to convert former nuclear facilities. Their goal became to convert something. It just turned out that the first facilities that they had to choose from didn't actually do much that was relevant to nuclear weapons. So they tried to convert them. But you would never have helped solve the problem of creating jobs for former nuclear weapons scientists because none of them worked in these institutes. These institutes did different things. Okay? So goal displacement. All the programs I looked at came to pursue different goals. They didn't pursue the goal they were given. Okay? And that had ramifications for their ability to do what they were supposed to do, which I'll get to in a minute. The second thing that happened, which again all bureaucracies do, is each of these programs tried to make, so they were each given a task, and it was a task they had never done before. It didn't really look like anything they had ever done before. The Defense Department doesn't normally convert former Soviet nuclear facilities. It doesn't normally convert former Soviet anything. It actually doesn't normally convert much. So they were given this program. And so to do it, they used the standard routines they use for other programs. They, in effect, tried to make the program look like something they normally do. And this happened in the Department of Energy and the Department of State. But because these 3 organizations are different, the shifting was different. So, for example, the Defense Department. In the early 1990s in the Defense Department, and people always laugh when I say this, if there was no established contractor, you used lowest bidder contracting to give out contracts. Now everybody says, oh, yeah, the Pentagon uses lowest bidder contracting. But in the early 1990s, if you had no established suppliers, you let contracts to the lowest bidder. So the Defense Department starts to look for U.S. businesses that are interested in pairing with them to convert former Soviet facilities. And so you would think they would have picked the companies in terms of who had experience with Russians, who had experience converting defense facilities, or who had some experience at least maybe in nuclear power, but instead they picked the lowest bidders. So as a result, the premier Soviet missile facility was paired with Double Cola as their conversion partner. Double Cola.
What's that?
It's a soft drink.
Coca-Cola.
It's a cheap version of Coca-Cola. We're recording this. It's a lovely version of Coca-Cola. But there's a famous quote from one of the scientists who was the head of this institute, and he says, it's as if you asked Los Alamos nuclear weapons scientists to make baby diapers. It was insulting. And so it poisoned the well. People weren't interested. They came away from this thinking the U.S. wasn't serious. The State Department, the standard operating procedure becomes something different. The State Department tries to negotiates relationships with other countries. It establishes mechanisms where everybody can have a seat at the table and you can talk about issues and you can resolve them. Okay? So the programs they were given to implement was U.S. participation in a multinational effort, which was aimed at creating jobs for former Soviet nuclear weapons facilities. And so the State Department focused on coming up with a beautiful process whereby everybody knew what was going on. It was easy to get agreement. It was easy to get consensus, but every state would be allowed to pursue the projects they wanted. They spent virtually no effort on trying to ensure that those projects were with former nuclear weapons scientists. The focus was on designing a process, not on the outcome of the process. Okay. In the Department of Energy, there were 2 programs there. For those of you who know DOE, The part of the Department of Energy that focused on these efforts is called the National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA. It's a semi-autonomous part of the Department of Energy that houses the U.S. national laboratories, some of which provide U.S. nuclear weapons research and design. Okay. Within DOE, within NNSA, the labs, the nuclear weapons labs, are used to pretty much determining what they want to do. Power is decentralized. The labs hold predominant power in that system. Okay? So when they were given these projects to implement, what happened for one program was they implemented projects that the labs were interested in doing, which was not necessarily the same thing as projects that reemployed former Soviet nuclear weapons scientists. Okay? The last program to focus on creating jobs saw this and said, we're going to keep decision-making authority in a central office in Washington, D.C. at NNSA headquarters. And as a result, the labs quickly learned, we're not interested in being involved in this. We don't want to do it. And they started attacking the program because they had no power within it. Again, standard routine procedures, different effect on two different programs. Right? So the programs go astray because goals are displaced, because each agency that's supposed to do this changes it in some way to look like something it's always done. And the third thing, just briefly, is each of these agencies also responded to external problems, and they started to copy each other's response. Okay? It doesn't mean they studied the problem and responded rationally. They copied what the other agencies did, usually without any coordination. They did. So for example, how do you know the person you're working with is a former nuclear weapons expert? Okay. You could ask them, and the Russian government initially would have said, why don't you take a long hike down a windy road? Because we're not telling you, that's a national security secret.
They glow in the dark.
They have 11 toes. Initially, you couldn't ask this question, but later on you could. But they never asked the question. Instead, the State Department started this process. They would give the scientist a list that said, please check off your nuclear weapons skills. And for nuclear weapons, there were about 8 different things, right? And sure, and they were reasonably specific, a little bit removed, but, and eventually the Department of Energy adopted the exact same checklist, okay? The problem is, if I was an institute director in Russia, and I was trying to get my scientists to participate in these programs, right? I know that the U.S. wants to fund projects with nuclear weapons experts. So I want nuclear weapons that be really scary skills, put those babies down on that list, all right? And I also get about 20% of the funding as overhead from my institute. And it may be one of the only sources of supplies that I need, which are now no longer manufactured in the Soviet Union, but I have to get from the West and which are very expensive, all right? So I have an incentive to inflate the skills of those people. Nobody ever checked. Later on, they come to adopt a shortcut. If you were old enough to have been employed during Soviet times and you worked in a nuclear weapons facility, you were by definition a nuclear weapons scientist. One program said if you had a master's degree or above in biology, you qualified as having critical biological weapons skills. Okay. They developed shortcuts, and they adopted each other's shortcuts without ever going back to revisit and say, are these reasonable shortcuts to make? Okay. And so as a result, programs that were supposed to create jobs for former nuclear weapons scientists ended up doing other things that were not quite job creation or doing job creation poorly. And in the process, they created problems for 2 overlying political issues. And I'll be quick here because I have taken up my 15 minutes and I'm moving the table. 1, domestic, political U.S. There was always a persistent debate in the United States about whether doing this work with Russia was reducing the weapons aimed at the United States and therefore a U.S. national security program, or whether this was really allowing Russia to spend its own money on modernizing its nuclear weapons complex, and it was charity or foreign aid, or something we shouldn't be giving to Russians whom we didn't trust. Defense, foreign assistance. Every time a program did something it wasn't supposed to do, or every time a program fell short of what it was supposed to do, this debate erupted all over again, and that created problems. The other overarching political issue was with Russia. Russia was skeptical of our motives. There were plenty of times in the early 1990s where the United States seemed to treat Russia as if it was a foe who had been defeated in a long war. Okay. So when the State Department and the Department of Energy couldn't cooperate, this was another problem I talk about, to go visit Russian nuclear weapons scientists, they each insisted upon their own delegations because they couldn't go together, two different agencies. The Russians would say, you're spying. Why else would you send so many people here? And that fueled a domestic debate in Russia about U.S. intentions. Okay? So you see there was an interface between the bureaucratic problems and the larger political environment in the U.S. and Russia about these issues. Okay? So that's the bad news in the book. The good news, which I'll say just very briefly, so there was an unintended consequence. At least I think it was unintended. The very groups that I criticize the most heavily in the book, which are the U.S. nuclear weapons labs, the U.S. labs, they do all kinds of crazy things. They don't keep very good records. They're not very good about prioritization. But in 1990, 91, 92, they wanted to see what the Soviets had done. How had they solved problems related to nuclear weapons? And then once they met these people, there was a commonality there, a basis for kinship. And so when the U.S. government started to pull back and said, Russia, bad, they would say, no, let's cooperate with these people. And so the very people I criticize actually helped open a chain of communication between the U.S. and Russia, which it wouldn't necessarily have been shut, but it would have been much smaller. And so one of the arguments I make is that U.S.-Russian policy was more cooperative and closer than it would have been without these efforts. Okay. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. Where am I wrong?
No, I don't. I think it's a great story, and I think it's an important story, and that just to confirm the last point that Sharon made about the lines of communication and the bonds, it's absolutely true, and I've seen it over the last 20 years. In fact, I'm going to Moscow on Sunday to meet with some of the weapons labs directors, and the meetings are being set up by the former director of the Los Alamos National Lab, because these are his such close friends now that he can set up those meetings where we can't get them through an embassy or anything else. And that was formed through this process, in part because, you'll laugh, but there are multiple reasons for it. I mean, because I've seen, before the U.S. stopped testing, you would see the lab, but after the Cold War ended, you would get leaders of the two labs together whispering to each other, you guys should resume nuclear testing. We want you to resume nuclear testing. Come on, test. Because if the Russians tested, we'd get to test. So there's this bond that weapons designers have that goes way beyond nationality and everything else. They really love to design cool weapons and test them. And so they actually had, as Sharon was saying, this great curiosity about how the other guys solved problems, but who they were. And then once they met, a tremendous affinity. And so I think that also is an additional explanation for some of the tendencies to just want to have a lot of contact and not so much stay on the task of finding jobs. Because a lot of times the people involved, understand, they don't know how to find jobs for anybody. I mean that's not their job. But like talking and sharing stories and getting perspective and intelligence, I think was an easy default to occur. But if this was not the intended consequence of these programs, as Sharon says in the book, it was a pretty beneficial one that has had some lasting value. I guess on the areas where there's more criticism, I think a real value of the book is the detailing of these programs and the telling of the stories, and so you kind of flesh out what happened and why it happened. I guess, like for the sequel, that part of me is wondering, okay, but how does this effort compare with conversion in other domains when you're talking about 50-year-old males who have lived in secret cities and have been prima donnas all their lives And so you take the basic variables that you're looking at in the former Soviet nuclear complex, because many of these people lived in cities whose existence weren't known. I mean, I sat with one of these guys in 91 or 92, and his son, he's one of the leading designers of their nuclear weapons, and the son says, "Pop, you remember when you were secret?" And so this guy's father was a secret, which is an interesting thought, actually, to have your father be literally a secret. But they'd come out. So it was a very special existence, and so now you're going in, this world opens up to figure out how to get them to do or help them do something else. And so I thought some comparative, in the sequel, like a comparative treatment of how conversion like that works with people with similar attributes, to the extent that that's possible. Because I thought if it was several thousand that actually got jobs, geez, that's higher than I thought. But so I think the comparative part would be very interesting. Another element that again, these are all things beyond the book, because I think what the book does is outstanding and important, and then it stimulates these other thoughts. But it's a lot of what the U.S. did in these programs was based on the idea of reciprocation, and if it were asked, would we give it? And because in a lot of, not necessarily in these programs, but in a lot of the other domains where the U.S. and Russia were interacting, well, what happened is the U.S. would say, well, we want to go do this, and if we're going to give you money, because for the early years after the Cold War, a lot of the cooperation was predicated on the U.S. providing finance. If we're going to give you the money, we've got to see this, or we want to see that. And the Russians understandably would shoot back, well, are you going to let us see yours? And the answer was no. But how much did that pervade at some point the thinking about what the U.S. was asking of the Russians, knowing that you're then going to be asked the same thing? Do you even want to go down that road? Because the answer is going to be no, or you're not going to go back to your boss and say, oh, gee, can we do this? Because are you crazy? So that kind of, I don't know what the right word for it is, but it's the extrapolating from your own kind of concerns in space and not wanting to go there. And then another thought I had was and this is a problem in a totally different space, but a place that you work on and care a lot about in Pakistan, but I think it's here in terms of the aid relationship, or whenever money is supposed to be going out of the United States to other people, especially other people that members of Congress might think aren't our friends, which means not Israel or the UK. That if you're doing that, the obsession and first requirement is for there not to have been any misplaced money or corruption. And so one tries to think of, well, in what other enterprise is that the number one objective? I mean, businesses don't, first you try to make money, and then you figure out, make sure that people don't steal it out of the till and account for it. But you don't go in saying, like, they didn't start Apple by saying, okay, how are we going to make sure all the money's really accounted for and everything else? I mean, you invent stuff, you go out and do it. But these programs start and operate with this obsession about control and making sure that the wrong guys, don't get it, and so on. Which I blame, like I blame everything on Congress. Because it's that's the worst fear of, and you must have encountered this a bunch of times, the people who are actually doing programs, the fear of an investigation in Congress and being interrogated by the Congress. How could you have done this? You talked to the wrong guy, or you spent money on the wrong people, and I think that has an effect. You point at this in some places, and I think it's very important, is once the debate starts, is this charity, and they're taking this money and our enemies are building more capability because we're giving them the money. And so when the congressional debate happens, I think then the people who are implementing the programs kind of go, oh God, I don't want to be in that fight. I don't want to be that target. So you try to figure out other stuff that you can do where you can say you're achieving some results, but it's going to get you in less trouble, and it starts taking you away from the original. So some of the goal displacement comes from wanting to avoid the wrath of, you know, what used to be Jesse Helms. And you talk about that, but I think that that's, and similarly, when the lowest bidder issue, I mean, a lot of times those requirements are imposed by Congress. So it's stupid, and it may be a policy of an executive agency, but a lot of times it's written by an even more stupid person in Congress and a committee who actually don't really care about the objective that's to be. So they're trying to solve another problem. So all of that is kind of, to me, is like stimulus that the book provides to like then thinking, you know, of kind of other arms of the octopus in what's a very important story. And I guess the last thing I would say is, again, to get you to comment on, is there was this time not so long ago in a galaxy like this one that people said, we're going to extend this program to other countries. And so let's be prepared to go to Pakistan and do this. I know people who were planning on doing this in North Korea. Very similar impulse, that when North Korea implodes, they've got these guys who know how to make nuclear weapons and have nuclear material and actually have lots of experience in the black market. What are we going to do, and who are we going to fly in on those first planes to go find those people and make sure they stay where they are? And what can we do to find employment for those people in North Korea? So I guess one of the questions would be, if you were brought into the next administration to say, all right, when North Korea implodes, knowing what you know, what should we do? What should we do?
Okay. Thank you for that. What should we do when North Korea implodes? That's the first, with their nuclear weapons scientists.
Right.
You should absolutely do something to engage, to work with, to make sure that their nuclear weapons scientists aren't interested in proliferation, or at least to mitigate the danger, because you can never do anything perfectly. But why is it job creation? Okay, and so one of the things I which is sort of glossed over in the book, but which I talk about, and we'll talk about in the sequel, and certainly the movie, is there was never debate in the United States. So the Soviet Union explodes, North Korea explodes. Why are you trying to, and this gets to your first point, convert military facilities to civilian employment, especially in some place like the former Soviet Union where there's no market economy? And especially this was something that Congress did settle these programs with, requiring that you use U.S. businesses, because there needs to be a boost for U.S. businesses in all of this, okay? The point I make is that was a dumb idea, and it was never revisited, okay? So what would I do with the North Koreans? So I wrote an article about this that's going to come out in December, and I said, you should bribe them. And I was told I can't use the word bribe, that it's inflammatory, so I use it here. You should bribe them. You say, we're going to give you some money not to do this. We're going to give you some money to go retire somewhere. We're going to give you some money to farm. We're going to give you some money to investigate that civilian application that you think you want to investigate. But the notion that a job for you is going to come out of it is very difficult to achieve, so let's not pretend that that's our goal. Let's do something else, okay? And in the process, we're going to keep tabs on you. We're going to talk to you. We're going to periodically engage you. We will periodically invite you to the U.S. to talk about your chicken farm, your new high-tech industrial project, your whatever it is you're doing. The U.S. programs that I talk about in the book, they dropped people. They never investigated. Even the jobs they created, they never went back to look to see if they still existed. I did for some of them, and it was actually easy to find, but they never asked. So the first thing I would do is say, it's not the policy, the agenda that's the problem. It's not the goal of engagement. It's the mechanism you're using to do it. And I don't think job creation was the mechanism we should have used in the former Soviet Union. I don't think it's the one that we should use as we're expanding these programs. People want to talk about North Korea and Pakistan. They've already expanded them to Libya, to Iraq, and to a variety of other places, and there's currently a plan to do it now globally. Okay? And they have backed away somewhat from the notion of job creation, and now they talk about what's called engagement. Let's work with people, okay? Which is helpful because you have no notion that you're going to create a job, that you're going to just maintain a relationship. And I think that that's an improvement.
When you, in the bribe idea, and you said maintain a relationship, so does this, you pay off every year, or is it and why wouldn't they want that payoff every year once you've established that
And why
credit?
wouldn't they learn to expect more of a payoff because we're afraid that they're going to proliferate? I mean,
No, I'm right.
Yeah.
Still be cheap.
Well, that's one is it would still be cheap. The other thing I always wondered about is we spent 20 years telling the Russians, we're scared you're going to sell your skills for money.
Right.
But, you know, we didn't get a whole lot of people who came up and said, I'm going to sell my skills for money. You got $100,000 for me.
Right.
So far that didn't happen, and I don't know the particulars. What I do know, and this is the scholar's cop-out, is the agencies didn't know them either. And they never looked at the question. I mean, the cheap solution to the Soviet scientist problem, and this is going to sound very heartless, is most of the people with critical weapons skills would be dead within 15 or 20 years.
Right.
We could have paid them pensions, they could have retired, we could have retired them here. There was a waiver written into U.S. rules to allow weapons scientists to come from the former Soviet Union and take jobs in the U.S. without the normal visa and immigration requirements. It was never exploited. As a matter of fact, I think the State Department never wrote the rules to implement it because there was never... So there were other ways to solve this problem, but they were never investigated because we focused on job creation and nobody ever looked back. The accountability issue is, I agree with you some because of this debate about defense or foreign assistance, there were things put into these programs that were difficult and concerns about accountability. This is true. I also should add I actually love Congress. Having worked there, there's some nice people. They try hard. There's some others on the other side. But the point is, there was never, in the initial stages of these programs, there was never the expectation that there would be accountability over every dollar. Okay? These expectations about accountability came in over time when it became more obvious that no jobs were being created. There were studies done in 1997, 1998 that created problems. Issues about accountability came in when the U.S. Government Accountability Office issued several reports showing that the U.S. national labs were taking 70% of the money for themselves and that very little of it was going to former Soviet scientists. Okay. So there were issues that helped reinforce that you should be looking at accountability. And quite frankly, I think they should have been looking at accountability more. So this created problems. I mean, for example, one of the key issues now is this former Soviet scientist which supposedly helped the Iranians. Did a U.S. program fund him not to proliferate? I could tell you that if it's found he was on the payroll of one of them, they're in trouble. Now, is that fair? These things happen, right? But as long as they're not the predominant thing that happens, aren't we better off? I mean, there was a GAO report that traced one of my programs to funding a Russian institute, which also helped with technical assistance to the Russian nuclear reactor at Bushehr. Okay. How useful is the Russian nuclear reactor at Bushehr in Russia's nuclear weapons activities? Not the most useful activity. Okay. Was it the same scientists? No. But the political headlines were Department of Energy IPP program funds Iranian nuclear weapons program. Okay. It didn't. But the point is, these issues of accountability, any problem, took place within a broader political debate, and it set it on fire. Okay. The last issue, reciprocity between the U.S. and Russia. This was a problem because the U.S. did promise Russia, we'll show you ours if you show us, and then we never did. But we showed ours to the Indians, or we showed them to the Israelis, or we showed them to a variety of other people, but we never showed them to the Russians. And this indeed was a problem. Part of the problem was that to get into the Russian facilities and to create closer cooperation, people promised things they couldn't deliver. Okay? And that's not necessarily a bureaucratic issue, but it did create problems. And eventually, the U.S., for example, the U.S. had a master conversion plan for part of its nuclear weapons facilities, okay, that eventually we showed them in, I think, 2002, which by then it was too late because nobody cared.
Right.
The larger point is, here's a non-proliferation program. It gets caught up in this mesh of bureaucratic politics, and over top of this mesh of bureaucratic politics is this mesh of domestic political disagreement, and over top of that is suspicions from a Cold War that lasted for a long time. Okay. My book talks about how if you had taken Bureaucratic Politics 101, you couldn't have solved or untangled this mesh of bureaucratic stuff going on here, but you would have known it was there, and you could have predicted how it would have created problems in the domestic and the international political environment. You couldn't have created jobs for all of those nuclear weapons scientists, but you could have done a better job. So. Jordan.
I actually just read your book, as I mentioned, on a couple of long plane flights last week, and it's really outstanding. So I can ask a question about something that's in the book, but you didn't mention in the talk today, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. In the book, you cite some polling surveys which showed, I think in the 1990s, that a sizable number of Russians who were part of the nuclear weapons complex said in polling surveys that they would be willing to work for a foreign government. It was a quite high percentage in these surveys. And so that would suggest that there were possibly thousands of people who in principle might be willing to provide their services to another government. But yet, as you say, we have very few examples, hardly any examples of people who have actually done that. And so your book shows that the programs that we provided did not, they can't explain that entirely. So how would you account for the fact that, in fact, very few of these Russian scientists have seemed to,
or at least that we know of,
actually act on this, or that we're not, are there a lot of cases that we're not aware of, or have just not many people really followed through on doing that?
That's a good question. Before I answer, he's talking about the Tikhonov. You guys did that, didn't you? Isn't that a Carnegie? I'm pretty sure it came from Carnegie. The Valentin Tikhonov, he surveyed. Okay.
It was before my time. If it's good, we did it, but I don't remember.
Just wanted to ask.
Before my time.
Okay. So there's a two-part answer. One is those surveys. The guy who did the surveys, I believe, worked. Actually, let me back up. If you really wanted to know how many nuclear weapons experts were interested in that, you would have asked different questions of different people. Most of the people he surveyed actually didn't work in the nuclear weapons complex because he wasn't allowed to talk to them. Right. They worked in facilities related to nuclear energy or more tangentially. Okay, so there's one issue is how much were they really willing to do that. The second issue, and this is something that seemed pretty obvious to me, and I'll be curious to know your take on it. If I had been a Soviet nuclear weapons scientist, I would have graduated from, a top facility in Moscow. I would have walked out of my graduation ceremony and someone would have handed me a ticket and said, get on the train with your family. And I would have gone to a very broad field in the middle of a place that gets very cold in the winter where the mosquitoes are this big, and they would have handed me a shovel and said, why don't you build a facility here? All right. So the notion that I would betray my country in that facility, I find hard to believe, except in extreme circumstances for a few people. They were patriotic. I just don't think it was that much of a danger. The other issue is, I think it was even less of a danger that they would have sold their skills to someone who wasn't a Western European or potentially an Israeli or an American. Now, I asked people in the programs that I studied what they thought of the danger of proliferation. And what I discovered is people who had worked with the Russians for 6 or 7 for a long period of time, and there weren't many, also thought that there was very little danger of proliferation. Okay. So I think they didn't sell their skills for money. I think we haven't seen it because things needed to be much worse for them. They didn't want to. They were patriotic. They didn't want to betray the country that had given them the things that they had been given. They didn't want to betray their families. So.
Just to add, I think that's right, and then to add to that, in that system and in some others, there's also a lot of counterintelligence. So you're aware that there are people who watch you, and your intelligence services watching you. And so you also have to worry about your people putting a bullet in your head, or the Israelis or somebody else putting a bullet in your head, and also your families being hostage back home. So if you go and you can't get them all out and you've done this thing, then what happens to the rest of your family? So it's a high-risk thing to do, just to corroborate what
That's fair. Rachel.
Thank you so much for this lovely presentation. I have a question about your comment about how there were lots of other ways to solve the problem that were never investigated besides this job creation program. And I haven't read the book, so you may address this. But I think that this is a common characteristic of bureaucracies as well. For whatever reason, something is set upon as the solution, and then there's no discussion about it. And so is there anything that you can draw from your particular case that might help us understand that part of bureaucracies better, more broadly?
One of the reasons I think my bureaucracies, I'm very possessive of my bureaucracies, didn't investigate other solutions is this was a pretty unique circumstance for them. They didn't have other similar things, so they didn't understand other alternatives. Okay, there wasn't. It's not like they normally did this range of activities and there were 5 things they could choose from, and then they could pay. It just didn't exist. This was a novel situation. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a novel thing, but the other thing that happened is, so initially there was such, people were scared. We've got to get in. We've got to do something, and there was such an emphasis on doing something that they didn't go back and investigate that. But over time, when they had the space to, they were so worried that if they did anything wrong, that if anyone realized that actually the emperor didn't have any clothes, that they would be shut down. Okay? So they hesitate to be innovative, they hesitate to ask questions, and they don't even ask questions of themselves. This should be a prime situation when these bureaucracies pick at each other and pick each other apart. They didn't, because they realized if one started questioning the other, they would all fall apart. Okay? So with so many other issues at play, just be quiet, just keep doing what you're doing. So there wasn't room for that kind of innovation to happen. And I think there became less room over time. Mark.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming.
Thank you for
coming. Professor. I had a couple of questions and a couple of comments as well. I didn't read the book yet, but I think this book will be important in light of, I guess in the context of 2 major events. I think one, nuclear energy renaissance that we're experiencing. And Russia definitely, I think, sees commercial nuclear activities as kind of a major aspect of their kind of called energy weapon or energy security. And so that will mean whether it's building a reactor in Belarus or Turkey, Russia will deal with more enriched uranium, more nuclear materials. So this issue will be more important as well. The other thing I think is important is most likely Putin coming back to power in March of next year. So there's concern about, I guess, the reset, all the progress that's been made, all the mutual areas of cooperation. How does that get affected? Which is why I think it's important to mention that we have kind of that channel of communication. We still have this progress, so that'll be important. I guess the other point I wanted to make was, obviously you focus on 3 agencies in the U.S., DOD, state, and energy. But I think it would be interesting to look at the same question in Russia, bureaucratic inefficiency, institutional inefficiencies, whether it's Rosenergoatom or Rosatom, and you'd see there are probably even more. There are huge issues. I think I remember reading that when Senator Lugar visited Russia, he'd have like completely conflicting accounts of you know, they would all the agencies, the regulatory spaces, they'd give them different answers. So I think it'd be worthwhile maybe not to do like a comparative study, but just to see, you know, we're sending all this money. We've sent since '91, we've sent probably $15 billion and more. I forget what the statistics were, but we've sent all this money. And how do we know that the Russian central bank isn't pocketing it, or obviously institutional managers aren't you know, allocating it or using it for corrupt purposes? So kind of seeing how the negative externalities of institutional of bureaucratic inefficiencies and how corruption can kind of seep into there. I guess what are my questions? Oh, I guess two questions. One, I mean, I think most of the people here are either students or professors, and so my question is, what policy recommendations, or you mentioned mechanisms, would be important, and do I guess, are these agencies like reading your book? Are they?
They're waiting outside.
I mean, what I mean to say is, I mean, for
No,
standpoint,
it's a
this
good,
is really interesting.
it's a great question.
Can we apply this, like how,
Yeah.
from a policy standpoint?
That's a great question, and it's completely legitimate. And I know you haven't read the book, but that part's not in there. So, so the first answer is, one of the things we learned from the book is we know what bureaucratic politics is, right? I don't add anything new to bureaucratic politics. What I do show is it doesn't go away just because it's about national security. And if you paid attention to it, you could have made the programs better. You could have wasted less money. They could have been more efficient. You could have done different things. You might have done, you might have changed your mind and done something different, okay? So we can do better. And so in that sense, the book is useful for policymakers because, one, there's an argument that these programs should expand, okay? The work in the former Soviet Union is winding down, especially in Russia. So Putin's going to come back, and my guess is we're still going down about this cooperation because it's too hard to argue that Russia, with its energy wealth, needs U.S. assistance to do this stuff. And Russia's less willing to make the sacrifices and the compromises it needs to make this agenda go forward. But we're talking about doing it in other places, okay? And when we do it in other places, we're probably going to adapt the goal. We shouldn't focus on job creation, but you're going to leave the programs with the same agencies that are currently doing it. So in that sense, the bureaucratic lessons are going to they're going to be in the same program. They're going to be in the same way. They're going to be the same problems. So we ought to pay attention to those now before we expand these programs. You're not going to get rid of these bureaucratic problems, but you can make them less of an issue. Okay, so that's one issue. The other thing I think that has policy relevance in this book, actually I'll say two things. One is bureaucratic politics is everywhere. We study it, we know where it is, but policymakers often have a problem and they come up with a solution and then they think they're done and they walk away. But the stage in between implementation is important, okay? And so more attention on that stage means we're going to be better off reaching this goal more frequently, more often with what we want to do, okay? The other thing which I think policymakers can take from this book is we didn't know what was going to happen in 1990 to the former Soviet WMD complex. We didn't know if there would be massive proliferation. It turns out there wasn't. We were uncertain. And in a situation of uncertainty, what do you do? Okay? And we're going to face that situation again. So, and this is something that I deal with only in one part of the book, but how do you make policy for a danger that you're terribly, terribly worried about, but you have no way of predicting it will happen? How do you deal with that uncertainty? And more importantly, how do you then, that you should revisit the choices you make about dealing with it? My argument is we never revisited it, and we should have. Let me get you after, in the back next to the window.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I apologize, I haven't read the book yet. Maybe you get into this more in there, but I wanted to ask about the metric of job creation. My understanding of these programs is that for at least some of the lead programs, it was a very important metric, but for state and DoD, it was not. And I was wondering if you know if those two agencies were ever told you need to go out and create jobs for these people.
That's a good question, because some of these programs would now start to argue, well, that was never our mission. But if you go back to the legislation that initially enabled them and to their own internal documents, it's there. All right, so there's no avoiding it. The metric of job creation, everybody was supposed to measure it. They just came up with different shortcuts for doing it, and those shortcuts were very poor approximations. Okay. But if you look, in the two big programs in this regard are one program in the Department of Energy and one in the Department of State. They both actually come up with processes for approving job creation projects. In the State Department, it's called, I love this, the POO factor. It stands for purity of objective, POO. You have to have so many people who have nuclear weapons skills before your project gets funding. So they knew they were supposed to be looking, and you have to involve, after 1997-98, when there were some external reviews done of these programs, you also have to spend more of your money focusing on job creation, not simply engaging experts. So it was clear that this is what they were supposed to be doing, but even after that point, they start to circle back and measure other things. Okay? The Department of Energy claims that it measured job creation. It never used the same metrics for measuring that more than 2 years in a row, and the metrics are wildly inconsistent. Okay? And it turns out, we know from the General Accounting Office, in many cases they're completely inaccurate. Okay? So that then creates problems.
Just one other brief comment, thank you. you had mentioned about possibly resettling folks from a country that has recently opened up their weapons complex to us and resettling them in the U.S. Full disclosure, I used to work at CRDF, and I asked that question once. Why don't they just come over here? It would be better for them. And I was told that for reasons similar to what you brought up about patriotism, a lot of them did not want to immigrate, and it also was diplomatically difficult for the U.S. Based on brain drain concerns for those scientists to immigrate here. So
That's fair. That's fair. I suspect the immigration option was only available for a certain segment of people, and there were scientists who immigrated. Most of them went to Israel or Western Europe or the United States. Several of them work on Wall Street because their mathematical skills are very good. So that's not, you're absolutely right, that's not a broad-based solution for this effort, only for a small group.
That explains the crisis.
Phil. He's next, so you guys.
First, a quick observation that George Berkovitz said. In today's paper, there's an article about some Georgetown students working with a professor who discovered, allegedly, a greater Chinese nuclear capability than we had imagined. And in your comments made me think, I should take that with a grain of salt, because it's in the interest of nuclear scientists here to claim that there's more going on there, so they get more. Thank you for that. But I will disagree with you about Congress, and I share. And I'm going to ask Sharon a question in that regard. That part of what you're describing seems to be the lack of a commitment from the White House or from the National Security Council to this issue. And one possible reason for that could be the answer that both of you gave, that after a while they realized maybe this wasn't an important issue, and so the bureaucracies did what they wanted to do. But another possibility is that there were no adults in the White House who cared about this. Bureaucracies will do what they want to do, and you need someone in the White House, not the Congress, you need someone in the White House who can oversee that and make sure it happens. Why were there no adults in the White House?
For part of the time, there were no adults in the White House, but I'll leave you to guess what part of the time that was. So there are people in the White House, Democrats and Republicans, during this time. Right. And the lack of attention happens at the beginning, middle, and end of the agenda. As a matter of fact, presidential attention to this happens very little. It happens for 2 years under Bill Clinton, and then he gets sidetracked when Congress flips. Okay, there are the things that happen. But one of the most frequent things that's been called for in trying to fix this problem is that there should be a czar to oversee these issues and to force coordination and to force presidential attention. And sure, I'm sure that would be helpful. It would be helpful troubleshooting problems with Putin. It would be helpful creating a public constituency for this. It would be helpful in educating members of Congress. The problems I talk about, if the czar noticed these things, I would be shocked. These are small-level bureaucratic issues. A czar is not going to solve these problems. A czar is not going to notice them. What you need is a demi-czar, a smaller czar. You need program managers that have more power to manage things at that level. You need convening power. You need, quite frankly, I think, more power to NGOs that have a stake in this agenda to convene people, to educate them, to talk about them, and to talk about cooperation. There was one point when I first started doing this in the mid-1990s, in the late 1990s, where all of these people knew me and all the programs, and they would call me and say, hey, do you know anyone over in state who might want to work with this Russian scientist on this program? Me. Okay, I was the convening point. Okay, you don't need a czar to do that. You needed someone lower down. Okay, so the notion that a czar would have solved the problems I talk about, he wouldn't have. He or she wouldn't have. Or if they were focusing on these things, then they were not paying attention to other issues. So, Tony.
Yeah, sure. And I haven't read your book, and I apologize.
Someone here's read the book.
Well, I know. And they don't ask questions. You can only ask questions from ignorance.
I used to.
As a lapsed bureaucrat, I'm struck by a couple of things, or a couple of questions I'd like to ask. One is when in my narrow bureaucratic mind, you start talking about nuclear facilities, a couple of words flash on my radar scope. One is top secret, and the other is Q clearance. And so the first question is, how much of what you were able to look at got around the classification problem of dealing with nuclear facilities and their locations and so forth? And it seems that's one question. Second, I spent part of my life as an Inspector General of the State Department. And this is the kind of question that I would assume that the 3 statutory IGs, not the GAO now, which also had an interest, would have immediately looked into because of the resources being channeled through the 3 departments into this program, and the kinds of things that IGs are interested in are metrics and so forth. Did the IGs look, the second would have looked at them together, did they individually look at the issue? And thirdly, the double COLA problem. I don't know much about procurement, but the lowest bidder still has to respond to an RFP. And the key question is, what did the request for proposal look like? What skills were they, at least in theory, bringing to the table which would make them qualified to deal with this rather complex issue of job creation of the Soviet Union? And were you able to look at the RFPs for these contracts? Because I think those would be, all of these would be interesting pieces of the puzzle that undoubtedly looked at, or that I sort of, as a bureaucrat, how did you go about finding the answers?
Good questions. So I did not see the RFPs for the Defense Department because those things happened before I started this project, and whoever has the files isn't talking. I can't find them anywhere. And I've taught this, and I don't think that anyone's hiding them. I think they're sitting in a box somewhere. And
they're not classified?
No, I don't think so. But I will respond. I do know a little bit about the State Department and also the Department of Energy, but I'll focus on the State Department. So the State Department would have job fairs where they would go to the American business community and later more broadly, and try and convince them to invest money in cooperative job creation projects with Russia. Because the State Department was in effect, like the other programs, offering a subsidy for businesses to try this. Okay? And so they would walk into the room, and if I was a businessman, I would want to hear, we're offering you a subsidy to get involved in a risky market. We're going to help minimize risk. We're going to help troubleshoot language, intellectual property, and contractual rights. And instead what the State Department said was, you should do this because non-proliferation is a major national security goal. Right? And I was never able to convince them that they should talk in the language of business to convince businessmen to become involved, not talk in the language of national security. Okay? The Canadian government, which was part of the science centers in the State Department, they talked about businesses. They talked about, they focused on Ukraine because of some common cultural issues, and they talked about that. They didn't talk about non-proliferation. It wasn't center stage, okay? So the same problem was happening there, right? So, and I was witness to that on multiple different occasions. So yeah, it was an issue because they were tasked to do something, but they weren't speaking the language that they needed to speak to the people that needed to be involved. So that was a problem. Inspector Generals. To my knowledge, the only Inspector General that looked at these programs was the Department of Defense Inspector General, which did 2 investigations into what's called the Defense Enterprise Fund. And that's because there was a whistleblower who was prosecuted. Okay? And both reports condemned the program, and it was eventually shut down for mismanagement, fraud, and abuse. Okay? So to my knowledge, there were no internal investigations. There was one U.S. nuclear weapons related facility that did an investigation into what it could learn from its past experience. It considered that investigation to be proprietary. They shared it with me briefly. I wasn't allowed to take notes, but they refused to share it with any of the other labs or anyone else involved in these projects because it was considered to be their comparative advantage. And in terms of classification, and this isn't quite the question you asked, initially in the first years, yeah, there was a real concern. Russia was concerned we were spying on them, okay? And they had every right to be concerned about that. We were spying on them. But the thing that got around that was a small group of guys from the U.S. nuclear weapons labs, okay? Sig Hecker will be one of them from Los Alamos, who led the charge in and said, you know what, we're going to knock on the door till we figure out what's going on because we care about this. We want to know what happened. And so they got it. There were some things that you never found out. There's some things you never learned to ask. But they got around that barrier because they wanted, it was a scientist to say, they wanted to know. Okay. For me personally, I never asked a question that would have required classification. You know, I did hundreds of interviews, okay? Not all of them are used in the book. I think about 150 I use in the book. I basically asked people what they did for a living and showed an interest in it, and people were happy to talk to me. When I went to Russia, I made a point of never asking to go to a closed nuclear city, because I know that they would have thought I was doing something else. So I didn't ask questions that were sensitive in that sense, so that was never an issue. And people were always, I think of all the people I asked for an interview, and there were literally hundreds, there was only one person who ever turned me down, and that was a DOE employee. People are happy to talk about what they do. You show an interest in it, and you treat them fairly. Yeah.
But some might, I'm delighted, because I would have expected a lot of this bureaucratic fear inside bureaucracies here, not inside the Russian bureaucracy.
No,
and that you were treading into areas which...
And even when I did interviews fairly high up in the Russian bureaucracy, the only problem I ever got into was I was having a meeting with someone who, I won't name him, but was very high ranking. And he was explaining something to me, and he was doodling the answer on his pad. And I grabbed his paper and said, why don't instead you do this? And the security people in the room went apoplectic, but I grabbed the man's paper. But anyways, but I survived, here I am, I'm good. Daniel.
I just have a question about congressional oversight. What about the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? What about Senator Richard Lula, who was the chairman at the time and was very invested in this whole process? Was he not?
Yes. Yeah. It's a good reason not to shut it down because things are going wrong. So the more serious answer is, this was part of a larger agenda called cooperative threat reduction, and the programs I studied were the smallest third. Okay, so there were bigger fish to fry. The other issue is, how do I know what I know? I interviewed lots of people. I've spent hours in rooms with 1- and 2-page documents. To find this out, you had to do a lot of legwork. I mean, I used to work for Congress. We didn't have the staff to do that. I'm pretty sure he doesn't have the staff to do it. There were a few investigations done by members of Congress asked GAO to do, but members of Congress give GAO a task, and oftentimes that task helps determine the outcome to a certain extent. Okay, so there were a couple of investigations done on what's called the Nuclear Cities Initiative that were not, I mean, GAO did a great job, but the mandate they were given, you were going to come up with critical results. Okay, my guess is also, if you believe that this is a problem that's worth addressing, even if you do it inefficiently, and you have significant foes in Congress that don't believe it's a problem worth addressing, why air your dirty laundry in public? Don't even go look for it. In the back. Yes, last question.
So you touched on some of the political implications for U.S.-Russia relations. I was wondering if you can go into a few of the implications for arms control and non-proliferation initiatives that this program answered.
Thanks. One of the things I learned from doing this is that nuclear weapons scientists can talk to each other when they won't often talk to other people. So in terms of arms control and non-proliferation, I think there's a future in that. And this gets back, and Mark mentioned something about the expansion of nuclear energy. So if we're going to expand nuclear energy around the globe, I'm not advocating this, you are also inherently expanding the potential for countries to make nuclear weapons at some level. Okay? So therefore you are inherently expanding U.S. insecurity about what those countries are doing, especially when someplace like, who should I pick on? I don't know. Sorry? Upper Volta is always my imaginary country. If I don't think there's an Upper Volta. When they start making nuclear energy and we worry about their nuclear weapons program, okay? So there's a way through scientific cooperation that we can at least be a little more certain of what's going on there, okay? And that has policy influence, I think hopefully a positive influence. So knowing and understanding is often useful, okay? Biotechnology is another area. Biotechnology is supposed to be saving poor countries from poverty, health problems all around the place. I personally have an interest in the expansion of biotechnology because I once was stranded on a very high mountain in Kazakhstan because people thought I was the marmot inspector. Marmots carry plague. Okay? I worry. I travel to lots of these places. I don't want plague to. So biotechnology has the promise that we can put a little station on the top of that mountain and we can understand if there's a plague epidemic before it comes here. So we help the people on that mountain, we help ourselves, okay? But if you know something about biotechnology, you know something about how to misuse it. So scientific cooperation holds the potential there for us to be more certain that we know what's going on. And I think more certainty for the U.S., especially in terms of national security issues, is important and is useful and makes us better at designing policy. At least I would hope.
Thank you for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.